Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the fifth section of Marxism 101, and our topic today is democratic centralism. So this is where we talk about the actual general principles of how we organize a communist party. This is about the party organization. It's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the organization of society in general. Like, we're not committing ourselves this far ahead to just exactly what the political forms of socialism would be. That's too complex a process, a little too far in the future for us to really nail down. But we can say, because we already have 100 years of experience with it, what are the general principles of organization of a communist party as such? So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. And the name of the basic principle is democratic centralism. So we'll talk about both aspects, the democratic and the centralist, and the relationship between them. So I just want to start with a little quote, which is from William Caston, who was our party leader for many years in the 60s, 70s. He said, this is roughly what he said. The principle is working class power. Everything else is tactics. Some people are a little taken aback at this remark, but the basic idea is, we have a goal in mind. We want the working class to become the ruling class. We want the working class to establish itself as a ruling class in order to create socialism and ultimately to move on to communism. So because we have a goal, we have a purpose, the work that we do should be oriented towards achieving that goal. So that's the highest goal, and that all other principles should be evaluated in light of how well they contribute towards that goal. So before we actually talk about specific form of organization, another point to be made is that the Communist Party must be Marxist. That is, we must use the science of Marxism, Leninism in order to analyze the world, to understand it, and to chart the way forward. And that this takes precedence over any particular form of party organization or any particular form of democracy. The way the party is organized and the way the party functions may change according to circumstances. For example, as taking a very obvious one, there are parties that have gone through both periods of legality and illegality, and obviously they have to operate differently under those different circumstances. But the party must still remain Marxist, and any change in its form and its procedures must not be at the expense of the party being Marxist and being guided by Marxism as a social science. And that furthermore, the party must be an instrument of bringing Marxist analysis and revolutionary strategy to the working class. This is what we mean by being a vanguard. We claim to be a vanguard party, but we're not making an idle boast of just simply announcing ourselves to be the vanguard. What we're saying is we aim to be the vanguard. We aspire to really fulfill that role of bringing Marxist analysis and strategy to the working class. And that's a position that we have to earn through our own work and our own struggles. And so again, everything that we do and the way in which we organize our work should be geared towards winning that position, not by any kinds of maneuvering or manipulation or power struggles, but by direct and honest presentation of Marxism in a way that the working class really will adopt and embrace it as their own tool. So the organization of the party should always be in line with these basic goals. So what is democratic centralism? What it means is that the democracy occurs at the level of debate and discussion when we have our own internal processes of talking about what our policy should be and what our strategies should be. The centralism means that once a decision is made, everyone in the party carries it out. That there is room for difference of opinion, but there is not room for carrying out of different policies within the party. That once a decision is made, we all adhere to that decision. That's the basic form of revolutionary orientation and revolutionary discipline that we voluntarily agreed to when we joined the party. That's just part of the game that we're joining. So I'm going to say here, this is, we get a lot of flack for this. Anti-communists will make a lot of play about the centralism, about, oh, the party is rigid, the party is autocratic, the party is dictatorial, people don't get to think for themselves, they just have to blindly follow the leaders and be clones. I mean, that's, this is just simply not so. Centralism, in fact, is a feature of any organization in any complex society. Any organization that's really effective is going to be a centralist organization. I mean, even if it's something like a choir, when you're singing in a choir, you've voluntarily signed on to sing what the choir as a whole is singing, not just to decide that you're going to start singing some other song. If you're in a soccer team, if you work for a business, pretty much every organization that actually effectively carries out any kind of work or has any kind of real goal is a centralist organization. That there's the difference between our party, the Communist Party, and many other effective organizations is in fact that we have more of the democracy, that we really do have the democratic discussion leading up to the decision making, at which point the centralist carrying out of the decision takes place. There's many other organizations where the centralism means that certain people in power simply make the decisions and everyone else goes along with it. So in fact, our party is not more centralist than any other political party. Our party is more democratic than any other political party because we openly acknowledge the reality of centralism. And we make a clear distinction about what aspects are democratic and what aspects are centralist. This is not to say that these are the same thing, that there can't sometimes be problems and difficulties. It's a real contradiction. And where we come down on the side of allowing for discussion and difference of opinion, and where we demand unity of action, this will vary under the circumstances. As I mentioned before, the difference between a legal and an illegal party, a party that's in a society with a lot of formalized political freedoms, as opposed to a society which is rather autocratic and dictatorial in the surrounding society. These things will make a big difference in just how intensely the centralist aspect has to be carried out, how intense our discipline of unity has to be in the centralist carrying out of decisions. But the basic principle that of democracy and discussion and unity in action is something that doesn't change under circumstances. That's generally the rule of any effective political party, any effective democratic political party, and that's our rule. So, however, when we remember that the main purpose of the party is to be Marxist, and that Marxism is a science, it's a social science, it's a set of analytical tools and method of analyzing the world. That means not all opinions are equal. Everyone has equally the right to voice their opinion, but that's not the same thing as saying that just any old idea is as good as any other idea. We also voluntarily, when we join the party, we are agreeing to the fact that we are members of a Marxist party, that we're going to evaluate our own ideas and other people's ideas in light of our understanding of Marxism. We are going to hold them up to the lens of Marxism-Leninism as a science to evaluate their usefulness and their truthfulness. So this in part also leads us to the idea, it's not the same as democratic centralism, but it's an idea which arises fairly naturally out of it, which is the concept of criticism and self-criticism within the party. We're not just a party which is just after power for its own sake. We're a party with the goal of working class power to implement socialism. So it's very important that we be engaged in a strategy that correctly leads in that direction. Social processes are complex, as we keep saying, and so it's a complex and difficult matter to evaluate policies and strategies to see whether they do in fact correspond to the reality and whether they lead in the desired direction. So it's necessary to reevaluate in the same way as any science is going to, any scientific result is going to be evaluated by your peers, it's going to be subjected to criticism, and it's going to have to be able to stand up to that kind of criticism. The validity of a scientific result has to be proven, both in terms of the content of the scientific idea and in terms of the methodology that was used to arrive at it. So social sciences also need this corrective mechanism of criticism and self-criticism. So the party, like any other body that's engaged in a science, in our case, a social science, has to make use of these tools of criticism and self-criticism to double check, to have feedback, to work out whether what we decided to do really did work and whether it had the expected result. So now, again, I want to emphasize that when we talk about democratic centralism, that's a principle of how the party should be organized. This is not a principle about how society as a whole needs to be organized. So once we turn to our work in mass movements, we can't expect that same level of discipline. We can't expect that same level of unity. And frankly, neither can we expect that same level of democracy. So it's actually really important to evaluate what's going on in mass movements and mass organizations according to somewhat different criteria. So when we come to the question, there's questions which arise that seem to apply more in general movements, because there we're going to meet people who aren't Marxists. We may have some agreement on our goals. They may be progressive people. We might be able to work together as allies, but they're going to have somewhat different points of view. And one of the areas where we really do have an ongoing debate, which has been going on for decades and doesn't show any signs of disappearing anytime soon either, is basically over the question of spontaneity versus organization. Like, we know that anarchists actually put a lot of stress on the value of spontaneity. In fact, they look upon organization as suspect in itself, as if any form of pre-planning or strategic thinking is intrinsically autocratic or intrinsically dictatorial or would intrinsically stifle the mass movement. Now, of course, we don't think that way. From our point of view, spontaneity has a very limited application and produces very limited results. When you're dealing with something as complex as class struggle and the replacement of one ruling class by another, organization, planning, having strategy and strategic goals is of the utmost importance. And it's very important that the party play the role of bringing as much clarity on that organization as possible to the working class and to all the movements and mass organizations that make up the working class and make up the revolutionary movement. So we recognize that spontaneity exists. I mean, we see spontaneous upsurges, but our goal always will be not to remain at this spontaneous stage, but to give those organizations and those movements as well organized a form as possible. In other words, to gain the most fruitful outcomes, even if it's a spontaneous upsurge of a movement, we want to see a more mature and a more organized movement arising out of it. And so we fight for leadership within those movements. not to be autocratic, but to be able to bring the value of organization and strategy and Marxist thinking into those movements to make them more united, more effective, and more conscious of their own goals. There's just one other point I'd like to bring up under this category, which is what Lenin referred to as trade union consciousness as opposed to class consciousness. These are some very famous passages that I've included in the notes here from What is to be Done, which is written about 1905. So that was relatively early on in the development of the revolutionary movement in Russia, of the workers' part of the revolutionary movement in any way. And where there were many spontaneous uprisings, strikes would break out, demonstrations would break out. The uncoordinated and inarticulate protest of the working class would break out. But then not that much would happen as a result of it. There would be flare-ups of struggle and then they would die down. And Lenin was pointing out that it was just essential that the party take on the role of trying to create consistency of building on these spontaneous outbreaks. And he also pointed out that what arises spontaneously in the working class, out of the day-to-day experience of people just working at the job, is not revolutionary consciousness or class consciousness, but just trade union consciousness. That is, they know that their job sucks. They know that their working conditions are bad, and they'll protest against it or even band together to form trade unions in order to fight to improve their working conditions. But that's not the same thing as actual class consciousness, of understanding what's the role of their class within the overall society, what's the role of all the other classes, how these classes interact, how the society as a whole functions, who are their potential allies and who are their enemies. All those things come from outside the ordinary day-to-day experience of working at a job. That's not to, again, the anarchists and other enemies of ours say that this is essentially elitist point of view, that we don't really trust the workers, we think the workers are dumb, whatever. But this is not true. We're not saying that workers can't come up with these ideas. What we're saying is that workers come up with these ideas when they take on the job of doing the scientific analysis, of actually studying their society, reading, understanding, analyzing. That just the day-to-day experience of being at work doesn't tell you how class society works. You have to look at what's going on with other classes other than your own. You have to have a broader view of social processes. And in the modern world, this has to come in part from study, from reading, not just from direct personal observation. So this is the important point that that Lenin was emphasizing about the difference between trade union consciousness and class consciousness. Not that workers are incapable of developing class consciousness, but that anybody has to actually do the actual real work of scientific study and learning about their society in order to become truly class conscious and to take part in that Marxist analysis, which we think is one of the main roles of the party. So I'm going to stop there and just throw it open then for discussion. I'm also going to stop the recording.